The purpose of today is to kind of create a roadmap, if you like. Where is the industry now? How do we all start to think about these concepts? And where can we go from there? So I want to take us back to what we're actually even talking about here. So ESG, often cited, but what do we really mean when we say these things? And how do we start to begin to educate ourselves? So Anita, what does it mean for you, and how did you arrive at understanding this concept?
So when I thought of ESG, I was more focused on the environmental aspect. I did not realize how broad the scope of ESG really is. And so Flex, for instance, in 2016, set out 20 goals for 2020 related to ESG. And there are 5 cornerstones of these strategies. The first one being people. Flex employs about 160,000 people around the world. And a lot of these people are in factories, which can be prone to injuries while working with complicated machines. So health and safety is important. Second theme, which is very important, we have a women CEO that is driving greater participation of women in the workforce, especially in leadership positions, and just encouraging diversity and inclusion and employee development. So that was the first one. The second one is community related efforts. That includes, so we have Flex Foundation, which works with nonprofits and makes financial donations to move forward with these social causes. And also employees around the world are encouraged to volunteer, and the company supports all those initiatives. The third one is environment. Being a manufacturing company, it is our responsibility to make sure that our carbon footprint is the least possible. So this relates to reducing the carbon, reducing the greenhouse emissions, diverting the waste from the landfills to the extent possible, using more renewable energy. The fourth one is innovation. How can we design products that don't end up in the landfill? Can we use materials that are recyclable, reusable? And then finally, integrity, which is ethics and compliance, anti-corruption. So this is how the whole sustainability framework within Flex is set up. And that's how I understood that it's actually really broad. It's not just environmental. There's a lot more that the common man probably doesn't think about.
When you look in Treasury specifically, even today, there's very few treasurers I've come across that actually engage with this subject. And I think there's so much to be said and discussed about this, particularly I'm sure we're going to talk about green bonds and power purchasing agreements and all that good stuff. But I think there's definitely a level of education that's required.
To be honest, I find the term ESG a little bit frustrating because I feel like there's a lot behind it. I mean, it's sort of shorthand for a lot of things that different people bring to the table. And so I think it's important to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what it means. Sometimes it's very much just a screen, right? So, okay, we check some boxes. We're not, we're not dealing with, tobacco or guns or whatever it may be. And so we're kind of from an ESG perspective, we're fine. I think there are a lot more, that's not going to cut it in the short while. I'm thinking that there's going to be a lot more deeper questions about, okay, what are the impacts you're currently having, and how are you going to mitigate those impacts? How are you going to improve on the metrics that are really material to your company? And so I think there's sort of going to be a deepening of conversation on a lot of these issues.
One of the things we talk about within this is sustainable financing. So what are some of the things that people should be aware of? There are a whole range of different options out there now, not just green bonds, although that is part of it. Where does sustainability and sustainable financing come in, and what do corporates need to know?
Sure, great question, Sophie. So I think green bonds are probably the first area where I think ESG has really taken off. So people are more familiar with that concept. I think what we try to do within Global Transaction Services is trying to bring in our trade finance solution set more into these treasury conversations. So if you take, for example, a very simple concept, with trade finance, we are helping our corporates, like the ones on the call, to finance their receivables from their suppliers. One of the things that we can do as a bank provider is give powerful tools, going back to your point around data, give powerful tools to corporates to maybe categorize their suppliers based on a certain set of ESG criteria. and maybe differentiate between financing terms dependent on their ESG metrics, and therefore providing an incentive to certain suppliers to improve their own ESG metric. And if you think about the entire change from the bank provider to the corporate and then to the supplier, again, you can really see how this whole focus on ESG is multiplying across the entire ecosystem.
Sarah, I feel like what we've just been saying leads us nicely into the next bit I want to talk about, which is things in action. But I want you to tell us a little bit about the work that you guys have been doing at the moment. You mentioned with me, the sustainability-linked loan that you've done and becoming carbon neutral. Tell us about JetBlue's story.
I'll focus on the E piece because I think that environment is probably what most people think about when they think about an airline. Even though globally we are as an industry responsible for about 2% of emissions, which I'm not saying is insignificant by any means, but I think there is a perception it is bigger. I think because it's a very visible industry and we are burning a lot of jet fuel. But there's been a big focus on the environmental impact of an airline. And so for us, I would say that's our most material ESG issue. I like to talk about the flight shaming movement. It is something that has appeared to have quieted this year, given that so much travel is on pause and there are so many other things happening. But it really does come from a real place. And when travel rebounds, we expect that conversation will come right back. And so through that, at JetBlue, we wanted to make we wanted to do something big. We wanted to show that we get it, we agree, we think people love to travel, but nobody likes the emissions that come with it. And so we basically, in this year, have become the first and only US airline to achieve carbon neutrality for domestic travel, which is about 80% of our emissions, so still the bulk of it. And today, the majority of it is done through carbon offsets. That said, there were two parts to our announcement. So one was the carbon offsetting big initiative. And the other part of the announcement was that we were starting to fly on sustainable aviation fuel on regular flights out of SFO, or San Francisco International Airport. And that's basically a drop-in renewable resource fuel that brings emissions down by about 80%, so really significant.
How do you see this year impacting these goals that we have as an industry working towards ESG?
This year, if I just look at asset flows, for example, the market was very volatile, but one asset class that consistently performed well throughout the year is ESG funds, for example. So they have seen increased inflows, and also their returns seem to be a little bit more resistant and not as volatile than maybe some of the other asset classes. So to your question, the response I think will be, Sophie, that I don't think this is going to fall away. And we're getting loads of questions on the US elections, and then of course the connection between ESG and the US election, right? And I think this is much bigger than that. I think, first of all, this is not just a US question. This is a global issue. And also, I think it's being driven by investor demand, and you can't really change that. I think in 10 years' time, if you ask me, I don't think we're going to be talking about green bonds and normal bonds. I think any bond issuance will need to also achieve sustainable goals, or it needs to achieve social goals. So I think this differentiation between normal bonds and ESG bonds will sound very strange in 10 years' time. So to your point, I don't think any of this will really change. I think if anything, it will just get further accelerated in the coming years.
I think the other thing that might happen or needs to happen is greater collaboration between governments and NGOs, corporates, and academia to have a holistic solution. So we bring the best from each of these fields. And maybe another step for corporates to take is to align their initiatives with the UN sustainability goals, so that we are all working towards matters that are pressing and something which will move the needle.
I sort of see this year as really the spotlight on the S in ESG. I mean, the E has always sort of taken prominence. That might be my own bias coming from that energy space, but it seems like that was typically the one that got the most attention. Used to the green bond issuances, far eclipsed social bond issuances, until this year, when obviously between the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, there's much more of a focus on the S. And so I'm hoping that gets sustained, and maybe we'll see the G also come up a little bit, but that there's a little more of a broader appreciation of the full range of ESG. And one of the nice things to see is the way the social bonds took off in March, April, May, in response to the pandemic, to deal with economic fallout, with pay for vaccines, things of that nature, and really building on basically the green bond framework. It was, I would argue, able to scale so quickly because the market was so used to green bonds. It's just a different application. So seeing that sort of innovation in practice, and I'm sort of excited to see how that might evolve as other issues come to the fore that people are trying to address.
And the last thing I think I was really pleased about, one of the benefits, dare I say, that came out of COVID is, with all respect to you, Henrik, the banks have finally come on board with digitized documents, right? Because would they have done that before, or as quickly as, I know in America or North America it's been in much earlier, but certainly not in Europe. So now we are absolutely completely digitized in everything we do in Treasury because we're paperless. So, hurrah.
Thank you so much. I think there's been a number of things that I can draw out from there. So I think what we've all agreed on is that people need to begin looking at the data they've got on this, holding themselves accountable, collaborating not just within their company, but within the industry, reaching out, not being afraid to share challenges and weaknesses, because that's how everybody's going to learn. And there's a great link with cybersecurity there, Royston, because it's the same thing. If everyone sits in a silo trying to solve this on their own, nothing's going to change.